the use of the concept of self-mastery is now, for the most part, focused on becoming sufficiently disciplined to be able to achieve success in your worldly desires, to get what you want out of life as a person. But self-mastery from the perspective of Sat Yoga is very, very different. It's not about getting what you want. It's about transcending all wanting. It's about letting go, not about gaining something. I do have to say that for the most part, the serious essays and videos that I saw tend to take off from Stoic philosophy, one of the ancient Greek philosophies, most popular, especially by the Roman time, with Seneca and Cicero and Marcus Aurelius, but going back to Epictetus and a whole tradition, a whole series of sages. But for all the virtues that Stoicism has, and it does have many virtues to teach, I think the most important of which is detachment, I think its virtues will enable one to live courageously in the world as a person and to face life and death, both, with courage and even with fearlessness, if one practices sincerely the teachings of Stoicism. But what it will not do is to take you to the realization that who you are transcends the level of being a person in a world. And that's where Sat Yoga comes in, because Sat Yoga is a continuation of the most ancient traditions of both East and West, but primarily of Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism of various non-dual schools, and of course the Shaivite wisdom schools of Kashmir, the non-dual schools, the Trika, the Kaula, the Krama, and especially the Pratyabhijna and the reorganization and unification of all of those schools by the great sage Abhinavagupta, whose picture is actually still on the wall at the top, and he deserves that position. And Taoism, of course, and we will be offering an approach to self-mastery that is most easily understandable from any or all of those perspectives, in which we are dealing not only with being, but with nothingness, and with the non-duality of samsara and nirvana, of the immanent life in the phenomenal plane and the transcendent consciousness of the Absolute. What I have found through the hard experience of working with thousands of people over the years, but especially in this last period when the ego structure has morphed even into a greater density at the collective level, but also fractally for the individual, is that nearly everyone is quite content to settle for a slightly happier life as an individual person in the world. That's the goal. Let me be a happy person. Let me achieve some inner peace. Let me let go of my suffering, at least as much as I can let go of and still be a person in the world. And the problem with having that paradigm and perspective is that most people, even when they have entered into the practice of yoga and the study of yoga philosophies plural, as in terms of the non-dual yogas, as well as the Vishishtadvaita yogas and Patanjali's classical yoga schools, which tend to begin by assuming that someone entering that wisdom school is in fact identified as a bodily person in the world living in duality or multiplicity. And there are very few who enter a school, or even long after they have studied in a school, transcend that frame of reference. And very few consider seriously letting the ego identity fall away forever and realizing God consciousness. It rarely even occurs to most egos as a possible reality to be attained, let alone one to be striven for with all one's might and one's heart and one's strength and one's soul. Very rarely does that happen. And so what that does is cause the ego that is not only satisfied with the non-transcendence into non-duality, but it is even rejects the possibility, actually doesn't want it, because they identify with the ego, and the ego doesn't want to die, it doesn't want to dissolve, it wants to sustain its identity and achieve its goals. And so even though the rapture of God consciousness, to anyone who thinks clearly about that option versus staying in the ego and trying to improve it or make it more sattvic or deal with life with more intelligence and virtue and whatever might seem to enable one to navigate the world of experience in a more healthy and positive way with less suffering, that's sufficient. But that will cause you to interpret the non-dual teachings from the imaginary register. And by interpreting them in that register of your consciousness, it will make the, let's call it attainment, or at least the return to our true nature, our full and complete nature as the consciousness that is God. It will make that into something that is felt to be a loss rather than a gain, a sacrifice and a submission. And it is true in a certain way that if you start out in duality and you wish to become one with God consciousness, because God will be perceived and conceptualized as the great other, the great spirit, the all-powerful Lord of life and death, that self-mastery will have to appear as self-surrender until non-duality is attained. Because the little false self identified with the body, in order to transcend that into the infinite consciousness, light, intelligence, power, deathlessness of your real self, that little self that's made of fear and desire and petty concerns, obsessions, and relationships of collusion and prejudice and projection, all of that will have to die. Your whole identity will have to disappear if you want to realize that you are God. And this is the obstacle that very few get beyond. So as I open this retreat, I made a lot of notes and have even had time to organize them, and I have no idea how many I'm going to be able to talk about. But it is the quality, not the quantity of information. But the first four threshold questions that I have for you, that everyone has to answer in order to even enter into this path, other than having an imaginary version of it. Because if you're in the imaginary, you'll either pretend you've already achieved it, or you'll create some imaginary proxy for it, or you will create some justification for why it's not really necessary and all is well with the role that you're playing in the cosmic drama, etc. But you really have to face at some point, usually in the middle of the night, and it can disturb your sleep until you've resolved it. Do I even want God consciousness? Do I want it? How many of you have actually confronted that question fully, head on? Okay. The second question, because what that means is you have not settled for living a life as an individual person in the world. You know that's false. You know the person is a fictional, crazy quilt of internalizations of the projections, fantasies, and desires of your family system and your social order and of the external other with whom you are mimetically enmeshed. So the question then, if you pass the first one, is, how much do I want it? I can say I want it and I can be serious, but it still could be, okay, on the weekends, I'll meditate. This will be a nice hobby for me. How much do I want it? Because if I don't want it more than I want anything else, I won't get it. And then third question, am I willing to pay the price? Because it's a huge price. It's your entire identity. It will literally go up in smoke in the sacrificial fire. Am I willing to pay that price? And then the final question I think we all need to answer is, am I ready to pay that price now, in full? Not on an installment plan or a credit card, but in full, cash on the barrel. And God takes only gold, the gold and light of the real. Am I willing to do it now, because I know that it's now or never? Is there anyone who can answer all those fours with a yes, with a total haji? Keep it to yourself. It's not for me or anyone else to know. It's probably the most private and personal decision you'll ever make. So then the question is, why? Why? What's the benefit? I know the cost. We've talked about that. And it does seem like there must be a benefit to abiding in God consciousness. But the ego can't even imagine the benefit. All it sees is the loss. So self-mastery, which means not the mastery in the little self of a particular skill, because most of the things you will see on YouTube about self-mastery, they are taught by a martial artist or some financial wizard, so-called, who will make you more successful financially, or some Don Juan who will teach you how to seduce people, or it will be someone who will help you have the discipline of achieving success in some applied form of your intelligence, whether it's an art or music or a scientific profession or philosophy or whatever. But it's always going to be limited to the ego's attainment of something in the world. And that has to be let go of. That's the cost, at least in the initial stages. But the benefit is total freedom. But the ego has a hard time appreciating freedom because it's freedom from the ego. It's the freedom of not having a mind filled with mental chatter, not filled with having a narrative, not filled with a constant flow of impulses, desires, drives. I want this, I need this, I've got to get this, I hate this, I've got to get away from this. Desires and aversions. And the other side of that, of course, is fear and anxiety. In fact, desire is a compensation and a defense against the underlying terror, the fear of death, fear of pain, fear of life, fear of loneliness. So many fears, so many things to be anxious about, so many worries. So the Shaivites say there are 3 malas and that we have to get free of. The first is karma mala, supposedly the easiest, but I think not so easy at all. What is the karma mala? It's the enjoyment of being an agent, having agency, being a doer, being able to get things accomplished, to achieve something, to have power, dominance, prestige, all the things that action in one's fantasy could lead to. And of course, a world in which one feels much more comfortable than one may be at the moment. But usually that doership ends up in disappointment. But that's the karma mala. That's the easiest one to let go of. Then there's the maya mala. But what is maya? It means letting go of all of your narratives, of everything you believe. And even more nitty-gritty, letting go of all of your attitudes toward life. Because they are all the attitudes of a person, which carry the signature of that identification, which is chained to the baggage of suffering, of the traumas that were involved in the initial formation of that persona. And then the anavamala, of course, the sense of existing as a particular being in the world at all, and letting go of the I thought that has organized all of your experience and your thoughts and given you a sense of order and purpose and meaning and whatever else has constituted the fabric of your subjectivity. So these three malas that must be transcended require a tremendous amount of determination and of clarity and of relentless, I would even say, well, the sages say, ceaseless practice until it's accomplished. Because every time the practice is interrupted and one falls back into the ego, it reestablishes itself, and it's like chutes and ladders, and you're back in square one. And that can happen even after years of sadhana. So the determination to achieve freedom must be of such character that it has the strength of will to overcome the ego drives and desires and diversions and denials and other forms of resistance. How many can relate to all of this so far? Yeah? Okay. Because you have to understand the nature of the situation in order to get out of it. And deeper than what I have said is there has to be a gut level as well as a heart level feeling that recognizes the unbearable torment that is festering in the subconscious mind. Whether you are allowing it to come up and feel it, or it's being acted out through symptoms of a somatic kind or a karmic kind or some other kind. But life as an ego is in fact torture, even though egos are very good at denying that and creating an illusory comfort zone. So the determination to transcend the ego now must be so strong that your orientation is, I must achieve this now or die trying. I will not settle for failure or delay. If you don't have that relentless orientation and commitment, then you may be wasting your time. So I want to go to the next level of perception that unfolds as you enter the spiritual path, if you have said yes to all of those questions, and then you say, okay, what do I do? Right? Because that's always what the ego says, as if it's about doing. But because the teachers have categorized students as either in the anavopaya mode, in other words, you believe you're a person in the world, a bodily being. So the teaching has to start with duality and with acts of doing. If you're in the shaktopaya level, then all it requires is a change of thoughts, but no action needs to happen of a behavioral sort. And then if you're in the highest level of readiness, then it's simply fully recognizing the truth of the real and letting go of the false at once. Supposing that you're in the anavopaya, which is 99.9%, I think, of students now, then you have to overcome some very powerful habits. Habits of dysregulation in order to achieve internal regulation and self-control, let alone self-mastery. So the Shaivites, again, to use their maps, because I think they're very accurate, there are 5 initial stages of mind or mental activity that you will discover as you enter the path of meditation. And meditation being defined as the silencing of the ego chatter. Just that. And in the anavopaya mode, if you are in ego consciousness, what you discover is the first stage of mind that you have to deal with, to your horror, is what is called the kshipta state. Maybe I'll write it. So. Let's see. You'll sometimes read it in more Sanskritic, like kshiptam and other variants. But what kshipta means is that your mind is scattered. In fact, your mind is so scattered that you're barely aware that it's scattered. There's just a constant flow of thoughts that are not regulated, they're not in some higher order, they're not directed towards some goal. There's the thought, I want this, and then I want that, and then, ooh, I forgot to do this, and why did this person say that to me, and what am I going to have for dinner, and et cetera, but without any control over what arises. You are at the mercy of your thoughts, and your thoughts are deliberately scattering because the ego is resisting concentration. It's not some accident. It's not some, shouldn't be a surprise. But that's the ordinary state of the ego. Extremely scattered. If one begins to meditate, one may also discover, as you calm down the mental activity, that it actually increases the bodily symptoms of anxiety. So that in the middle of your meditations, you begin to scratch and you begin to move and you begin to touch yourself and you begin to have all kinds of anxiety somatizing symptoms in which you can't sit still. Sometimes people will crack their knuckles. Other times they will pull their hair or curl it, or sometimes they will have other little tics and habits. But hardly anyone can sit still, mentally and physically, because of the kshipta and the mudha stages of mind. How many can relate to having those two stages still happening? Yeah? Okay. Well, they need to be dealt with before there can be any serious transformation. And so the third stage happens when you get serious about trying to stop the scattering of your thoughts. So vikshipta is the effort to keep your thoughts concentrated on the goal of meditation. But in the vikshipta state, you can't do it. The mind always escapes. You can get to silent present for a few seconds and then suddenly a thought comes and you're caught in a reverie, in a memory, in a dream, in some other diversion. And then you try to pull it back after you realize that you got lost again, but you can't hold it, and you're in a constant yo-yo of trying to stay one-pointed and losing it. And then your meditation, you begin to feel it's gone bad, I can't do it, and more hopeless and negative thought forms tend to arise. But you're at least creating the habit of effort, and that's essential. And that habit, if you continue regardless of the successive failures of the effort and don't become hopeless, you will get to the next phase. I was going to write akagrata, but akagra is sufficient. And that stage is when you have succeeded with great effort of keeping the mind one-pointed. Ek means one. Ekagra means I can keep the mind one-pointed. And by the way, the Shaivites, the sages of that tradition, as well as others, recommend, and I agree, that the point of focus in meditation to keep you one-pointed should be focusing in the third eye. You can also focus in the heart, you can focus in the Taoist Dantian, but the third eye is going to raise the Kundalini energies if you stay one-pointed in it. So the Akagra state is when you've achieved the ability to stay one-pointed, but with great effort, and if you stop making the effort, you lose it again. And then, finally, the fifth state, the Niruddha state. And Niruddha means that you are now effortlessly one-pointed. You can effortlessly remain in the state of thought-free presence. And that's the key. Can you keep the mind free of all thoughts and all agitation? Because that is the portal to God consciousness. If you cannot remain in stillness, You cannot reach the inner sun of spiritual power.